When people talk about Noah, they usually imagine the biblical image they grew up with. A massive ark floating over endless waters, animals lined up two by two, and a man with a long beard chosen by God to restart humanity. It's a story carved into the consciousness of Western culture. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Islam tells this story too, and in some ways it goes even deeper. The Quran dedicates entire passages to Noah, not just as a character in an ancient flood myth, but as a moral figure whose struggle represents something timeless about humanity. The Islamic perspective doesn't just stop at flood came, people drowned, and an ark survived. It frames Noah's story as a message about the clash between truth and arrogance, faith and rebellion, mercy and judgment. The Quran presents Noah as one of the earliest prophets sent to humanity. His role wasn't simply to build an ark, it was to warn his people. For hundreds of years, the Quran says he preached for 950 years. He stood before a society that had fallen deep into corruption, arrogance, and idol worship. He told them to return to the oneness of God, to abandon their idols, to embrace humility and gratitude. But most of them laughed, rejected him, and mocked his persistence. Imagine that, nearly a millennium of calling people to something better, and instead of listening, they treated him like a crazy old man. That's the Islamic picture of Noah, not just a shipbuilder, but a prophet whose patience stretched across centuries, and that's something that often gets lost when people think about Noah. Islam emphasizes that prophets didn't just show up when catastrophe was already inevitable. They were warning signs, human reminders sent. Participation was asking people a chance. Noah's people weren't destroyed just because they lived in the wrong time period, or because a natural disaster randomly struck. They were destroyed because they rejected every opportunity to change. The Quran paints this as a deliberate choice they made, to ignore truth when it stood right in front of them. And this is one of the most striking things about the Islamic telling. It isn't just about a flood, it's about the psychology of denial, about people who convince themselves that they know better than reality itself. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. In the Quran, when Noah finally realizes that his people aren't going to listen, he turns to God with a prayer. He asks for help because after centuries he knows his voice won't reach them anymore. And that's when the command to build the ark comes. But notice the sequence. It's not like God just suddenly decided to drown people. The narrative builds on the idea of endless warnings, endless patience, and only then judgment. That detail matters because it reshapes how we view the flood. Instead of being a random act of divine anger, it's the final chapter of a very long story about human stubbornness. And the ark itself becomes symbolic in Islam. It's more than a boat. It's a sanctuary for those who believe amidst a drowning world of faith, amidst a drowning world of arrogance. When the rains come and the earth gushes forth water, it's as if creation itself joins in on the judgment. The Quran describes the sky pouring down and the earth spewing out, waters meeting in a way that was decreed. It's not just a storm, it's a cosmic event, precise, intentional, unstoppable. And in the middle of it, the ark carries the believers, the animals, and the promise of continuity. But here's something haunting. In the Islamic telling, Noah's own son is among those who drown. This isn't just a myth about strangers. It's a story where the pain cuts into Noah's family. The Quran captures the moment. As the flood rises, Noah calls out to his son, urging him to come aboard, but the son refuses. He says he'll take refuge on a mountain, believing he can outsmart the water. And then the waves sweep him away, because it strips the story of any sense of comfort or distance. Noah isn't a superhero untouched by the tragedy. He's a father who has to watch his own son vanish under the waves because of arrogance and disbelief. It makes the entire event more human, more heartbreaking, and it reinforces the point guidance is a choice. Even family ties can't force someone to believe. Now think about that. The Quran is saying that truth isn't inherited. You don't get a pass just because your father is a prophet. Every individual has to make their own decision about what they stand for. That's a theme that runs throughout Islam's telling of history. It's not about bloodlines, it's about belief. Noah's story is one of the most dramatic illustrations of that principle. You could be the son of a prophet and still drown because of your arrogance. You could be an outcast in society but survive because of your faith. The categories flip, and it forces us to reconsider what success really means. When the waters finally recede, the ark rests on Mount Judy, not Ararat, as the Bible says, but a mountain mentioned specifically in the Quran. From there, humanity begins again. But in Islam, it isn't just the start of a new lineage. It's the continuation of a spiritual struggle. Noah becomes a model of perseverance, to someone who never gave up despite centuries of rejection. His story is told in multiple chapters of the Quran, Surah Hud, Surah Na, Surah Al-Qamar, and others, each emphasizing different angles: his patience, his warnings, the arrogance of his people, the moment of the flood, and the aftermath. And maybe this is why the Islamic telling of Noah matters so much. It's not just an old tale, it's a mirror. It asks, how do we respond when truth challenges our comfort? How long can someone warn us before we tune them out? Are we like Noah, holding on to conviction even when mocked? Or are we like his people, laughing until it's too late? These aren't just historical questions, they're psychological ones, spiritual ones, human ones. The flood in Islam isn't only a story about water. It's a story about the weight of choices, the stubbornness of denial, and the cost of ignoring what's right in front of us. It's about how truth doesn't bend to popularity, how arrogance can drown entire civilizations, and how salvation sometimes looks like a lonely ark drifting on endless waters. Noah's legacy is carved into the Quran not as a bedtime story, but as a warning that every generation should hear. And this is only the beginning, because once you see Noah's story in Islam, you start to realize it's connected to something bigger, a chain of prophets, a repeating cycle of human behavior, a pattern of arrogance and humility that keeps playing out across history. The Quran doesn't just tell Noah's story to entertain, it tells it to remind us. We're not so different from the people who drowned. We still make the same mistakes. We still laugh at inconvenient truths. And maybe, just maybe, the flood isn't only about the past, it's about the warnings we ignore today. The thing about Noah's story in Islam is that it's not just about the flood, it's about the warnings that came long before it. And if you really dive into it, you start to realize that this is the core message. Islam portrays Noah not as a man who simply survived a disaster, but as someone who lived through one of the longest experiments in human stubbornness. The Quran emphasizes that he preached for 950 years. Imagine that, almost 1,000 years of standing in front of people, repeating the same truth, while generation after generation brushed him off. That's not just endurance, that's almost a superhuman level of patience. But here's what's fascinating. Islam doesn't present his people as villains in some cartoonish way. They weren't snarling monsters. They were regular human beings who thought they were too advanced, too intelligent, too secure in their lifestyles to bother listening. That's what makes the warnings of Noah so relevant today. His people dismissed him the same way modern people dismiss uncomfortable truths. They said he was just another man, nothing special, someone with no power or wealth. They pointed at the poor people who followed him and mocked the whole movement. To them, faith was a joke because it didn't match their sense of superiority. That's what arrogance looks like in the Quran's telling. It's not always about violence or cruelty. Sometimes it's just the refusal to admit you might be wrong. And Noah never stopped. That's the part that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. He didn't just preach once a week. He didn't just write a book and hope people read it. The Quran says he called them day and night, in public and in private, with reasoning, with gentleness, and with warnings. He tried every possible method. He didn't give up when they mocked him. He didn't stop when they ignored him. He just kept going for 9.5 centuries. That kind of persistence is beyond anything we can imagine. Most of us can't even handle being ignored for 5 minutes, let alone 5 centuries. But the people's reactions are described in this really vivid way in the Quran. It says they put their fingers in their ears, they covered themselves with garments, and they insisted more and more in their arrogance. Think about that image. Literally plugging your ears and pretending not to hear. It's almost childlike, but it captures a psychological truth. People will go to ridiculous lengths to avoid confronting something they don't want to accept. They'll distract themselves, they'll cover it up, they'll rationalize it away. That's what denial looks like, and that's what Noah faced every day of his life. Now, here's where it gets heavy. Islam doesn't just tell us what Noah said, it shows us his internal struggle. The Quran records his prayer, where he cries out to God about how his people have ignored him, how they've followed the powerful and the wealthy instead of the truth, how they've passed down arrogance to their children. It's not just an external conflict, it's emotional, spiritual exhaustion. You feel the weight of a man who has tried everything, who has endured ridicule for centuries, and who knows that time is running out. It's raw, it's real, and it makes Noah's warnings feel less like mythology and more like the lived frustration of someone trying to wake people up before it's too late. And then there's this detail that really flips the story. In the Quran, Noah warns his people that if they repent, if they turn back, they'll be forgiven, and not only forgiven, but blessed. He tells them that God will send rain, will give them gardens, will grant them children and prosperity. So it wasn't just fear-mongering about punishment. It was a balanced message. If you keep ignoring, you'll destroy yourselves. But if you turn back, you'll thrive. That's a powerful insight into how Islam frames prophets. They weren't there just to condemn. They were there to heal, to offer hope, to show people that the path of humility actually leads to flourishing. The warnings weren't just doom and gloom. They were invitations to something better. But the tragedy is that almost no one listened. The Quran makes it clear. Only a handful believed, and that handful weren't the elite, the rich, the powerful. They were the marginalized, the overlooked, the ones society didn't value. That right there is another theme that Islam keeps hammering. Truth often starts at the bottom. It's the people without pride, without arrogance, who are open enough to accept it. The ones at the top, too invested in their own superiority, open enough superiority, can't let go. And so history repeats. The rich laugh, the poor believe, and the prophet stands in the middle, rejected by the majority. What's striking is how modern this feels. You look at the world today and you see the same dynamics. People dismiss uncomfortable truths because it threatens their sense of control. They follow the powerful because it feels safer than admitting they've been wrong. They mock those who choose a simpler, humbler path. It's like the psychology of Noah's people never went away. The story in the Quran isn't just about a flood thousands of years ago. It's about patterns of human behavior that play out in every era. And eventually, after centuries of being ignored, Noah prays in a way that sounds almost shocking. He asks God not to leave any of the disbelievers alive. He says they'll only continue, they'll only spread corruption and raise more arrogant children. It sounds harsh, but it's the culmination of 1,000 years of watching people pass their arrogance down like an inheritance. From Islam's perspective, this wasn't cruelty, it was reality. They had chosen their path so firmly that there was no turning back. The flood was no longer just a punishment. It was a reset. That's what makes the warnings of Noah so significant. They weren't empty threats. They were a record of patience, a proof that humanity was given every chance before the waters came. The flood wasn't sudden, it was the end of a very long story. And that's something that Islam emphasizes again and again with every prophet. People are always warned first. Judgment is never a surprise attack. It's a response to centuries of ignoring the truth that was right in front of them. The warning of more than history become Noah manna, become more than history. They become a mirror. They ask us, how many times do we ignore the truths we already know? How many warnings do we brush off because they don't fit our comfort zones? How often do we plug our ears and distract ourselves rather than face the reality that maybe we need to change? That's the power of this story. It's not about building a boat. It's about building awareness before the storm hits. And this leads naturally into the next part of the story. Because after all the warnings, after all the years of patience, there comes a moment when the command is given, build the ark. The shift from words to action, from preaching to preparing, marks the turning point in Noah's life and in the lives of his people. And the way Islam describes that moment, the way it frames the building of the ark and the reactions of the people around him, is one of the most powerful images in the Quran. When the command finally comes for Noah to build the ark, it's not just about wood and nails. In Islam's telling, this moment represents a huge shift, a line being drawn in history. After nearly 1,000 years of warnings, the era of patience was over. Now came the era of action. And what's so striking is that the Quran doesn't describe the ark in technical detail. It doesn't give us blueprints or measurements like some biblical traditions do. Instead, it focuses on what the ark meant. It was a symbol of separation between those who trusted in truth and those who trusted in their own arrogance. Imagine Noah, this old man who had spent centuries preaching, suddenly out there chopping wood and putting together this massive structure. To his people, it must have looked ridiculous. Here was the guy they had laughed at for generations, now building a giant boat on dry land. The Quran highlights their reaction. They mocked him relentlessly. Every time they passed by, they would laugh and ridicule. And the irony is powerful. They laughed at the very thing that was about to save lives. That's the tragedy of arrogance. People think they're being clever while they're standing on the edge of disaster. But Noah didn't stop. He kept building plank by plank, nail by nail. And this is where the story really shows us the nature of faith in Islam. Faith isn't just about words, it's about action. It's about preparing, even when the storm hasn't come yet. Noah didn't wait for the rain to start before he began. He trusted the command, trusted the unseen, and acted on it. That's why the ark is so much more than a boat. It's a testament to what belief looks like when everyone else thinks you're crazy. And here's the wild part. The Quran suggests that while Noah was building, people were still carrying on with their normal lives. They were farming, trading, living, and all the while, this massive structure was rising in front of them like a warning they refused to see. It's almost cinematic if you picture it. The sky is still clear, the sun is shining, and in the middle of the valley, an ark grows taller day by day. But instead of asking, what if he's right? They double down on their mockery. That's the psychology of denial. When confronted with evidence, some people don't reconsider. They laugh louder to cover up their fear. What's fascinating in Islam's version is that Noah isn't depicted as trying to hide the ark. He's not secretive about it. It's built in plain sight. Everyone can see it. Which means everyone had one last chance to think, maybe this is real, but almost nobody did. They couldn't admit that the man they mocked for centuries might actually be right. Pride wouldn't let them. And that's one of the most relatable lessons in this story. How often do we ignore something true just because it threatens our ego? Then comes the gathering. The Quran describes how Noah is instructed to take pairs of animals, his family, and the believers aboard. This part is so symbolic because it isn't just about survival, it's about continuity. The ark becomes a vessel not just of life, but of legacy. Every creature that steps on board represents the preservation of creation itself. And at the same time, every step onto that ark is a declaration of faith. For the handful of believers getting on wasn't just about safety, it was about siding whole truth against a whole society that had mocked them. Think about that courage. To climb aboard a wooden structure in the middle of dry land, in front of neighbors who are laughing at you, and say, "I trust this." That takes guts. But then comes one of the most heartbreaking details in the Quran. When it's time to board, Noah calls out to his own son. He begs him to join. And the son refuses. He says he'll climb a mountain, that he'll be safe there. It's a moment that hits harder than almost anything else in the story, because it shows the limits of even a prophet's power. You can't force someone to believe. You can warn them for centuries. You can build an ark right in front of them. You can beg them as a father. But at the end of the day, each soul chooses its own path. Noah's son chose pride, and the waves swallowed him. That moment is brutal because it humanizes Noah. He's not just a distant prophet. He's a father watching his own flesh and blood drown in arrogance. It's a reminder that truth doesn't bend for family ties. It doesn't give special treatment because of lineage. In Islam, faith is personal, independent. You can't inherit it, and you can't outsource it. Even the son of a prophet can drown if he chooses pride over humility. That's a terrifying but liberating thought. It means every one of us stands on our own decisions. Then the storm begins. The Quran paints it as this cosmic event. The sky bursts open, the earth gushes forth, waters meet by divine command. It's not just rain, it's the heavens and the earth releasing their forces together. This wasn't a natural disaster in the random sense. It was intentional, overwhelming, and unstoppable. And in the middle of it all, the ark rises. The mockery is silenced. The laughter drowns in the roar of the waves. And suddenly, what once looked like madness becomes salvation. The symbolism here is undeniable. The ark is a floating divide between arrogance and humility, between denial and acceptance, between life and death. It shows that salvation often looks ridiculous until the storm hits. That's what faith is, trusting the unseen, preparing for the future even when the present looks fine. The mockers thought they were safe, thought they were clever, thought they were too smart for warnings. And then, when the waters rose, there was no mountain high enough to save them. This is the heart of the story's power. The ark isn't just about surviving a flood thousands of years ago. It's about the way truth works in every era. People mock, they deny, they laugh, until suddenly reality crashes in and there's no time left. The flood becomes a metaphor for every ignored warning, every consequence of arrogance, every disaster we pretend won't happen, and the ark becomes a metaphor for preparation, humility, and trust in something bigger than ourselves. As the waters rise higher, as the world is swallowed by the flood, the ark floats steadily, carrying its fragile cargo of faith and life. The mockery has ended, the laughter is gone, and what remains is silence, water, and the realization that truth was in front of them all along. And that's where the story shifts again, because the flood isn't forever. The Quran describes how eventually the waters recede, the earth swallows what it released, the sky closes, and the ark comes to rest on a mountain. And it's at this point, when the storm has passed, that the deeper meaning of Noah's story, really not just survival, but what comes after. When the flood finally ended, it wasn't just water retreating, it was history resetting itself. The Quran describes the moment with this powerful imagery. The heavens held their rain, the earth swallowed its water, and the command was fulfilled. What had once been a raging storm transformed into silence. The ark, after drifting for who knows how long, came to rest on a mountain called Judy, not Ararat like the biblical version, but Judy. And that detail matters, because it shows how Islam roots the story not just in myth, but in a specific geography, anchoring it into the world's memory. But the real focus isn't on the mountain or mechanics of how the flood ended. It's on what came next. Because for Noah, stepping off the ark wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. He had lived through the destruction of his entire people, watched his own son drown, and now he stood as the patriarch of a new beginning. That's heavy. Imagine the silence of the earth when the waters dried, the emptiness of a world where laughter and arrogance had been swallowed whole. There's no way to step into that without feeling the weight of both loss and responsibility. Islam portrays Noah as a man who didn't just endure catastrophe, but who embodied patience through it. His role wasn't just to save the believers physically, it was to carry forward the covenant, the unbroken line of truth that started with Adam and continued through every prophet. The flood wiped away a generation that mocked, but it didn't erase the mission. That's the key. The mission wasn't even about the ark. It wasn't even about the flood. It was about reminding humanity of what it means to live with humility, gratitude, and obedience to something greater than ourselves. And this is where the Quran's perspective is so unique. It doesn't frame Noah's story as a one-off disaster in the past. It frames it as part of a recurring cycle. Noah was one prophet among many, and his people were one community among many. The flood wasn't just an ancient punishment. It was a lesson, a warning to every future society that falls into the same arrogance. That's why the Quran repeats Noah's story across different chapters, each time highlighting a different angle. Sometimes the emphasis is on his patience, sometimes on the mockery he faced, sometimes on the destruction, because sometimes on the survival. It's a mirror that reflects whatever age looks mirror, because whatever age looks into it. And when you think about it, the covenant in Noah's aftermath isn't spelled out in Islam the way it is in the Bible, with the rainbow as a sign. Instead, the covenant is more existential. It's the reminder that humanity gets chance after chance, that destruction comes only after endless warnings, that prophets will always be sent, and people will always be given time. The covenant is continuity itself. Even when in chain of Gaijin civilizations are never washed away, the commenters of long civilizations are myths and washed away. But the Quran doesn't shy away from the emotional side either. It recounts Noah's grief over his son. After the flood, he turns to God, asking why his child wasn't saved, reminding him that he was family. And the reply is stark. He was not of your family. His conduct was unrighteous. That hits hard. It redefines family not as bloodline, but as shared values, shared truth, shared faith. In Islam, this is a radical idea. Your true family are those who walk the same path of humility and faith, not just those who share your DNA. For Noah, that was a painful lesson, but it's one that defines how Islam views community. It's about choice, not inheritance. Now, think about how modern this feels. We live in a time where bloodlines, tribes, nations, and identities dominate so much of how we see ourselves. But the story of Noah flips that. It says the real identity is belief, the real family is conviction. The real survival isn't about genetic continuity, it's about spiritual continuity. That's what Noah passed on after the flood. Not just human life, but a principle that arrogance drowns and humility survives. And here's the haunting part. The Quran says that for generations after, people still ignored the lessons. They remembered the flood, they knew the story, but arrogance crept back in. New prophets came, new warnings were given, and the cycle repeated. That's almost depressing, but it's also deeply human. We forget, we rebuild, we prosper, we get comfortable, and then we fall into the same traps. Noah's story isn't unique, it's archetypal. It's the blueprint of human forgetfulness. But the aftermath of Noah's flood isn't just about the failure of people to remember. It's about the resilience of prophets to keep reminding. Islam frames history as this tug of war between arrogance and humility, denial and truth, destruction and survival. Noah's flood was one battle in a war that stretches across centuries. And that's why his story is told with such weight. He's not just a figure of the past. He's a warning that never expires. Think about what it must have been like for Noah to step off the ark. The silence, the emptiness, the realization that almost every face he had ever known was gone. Friends, neighbors, relatives vitally, all washed away. The few survivors around him weren't just people anymore. They were the seed of a new humanity. Every word, every action, every decision carried enormous weight, because from them entire nations would eventually emerge. That's a kind of responsibility that's hard to even imagine. And yet, despite the trauma, despite the grief, Noah is remembered in Islam not as a broken man, but as a figure of strength, perseverance, and faith. He's called one of the greatest messengers, one of the most steadfast. He's a reminder that patience, no matter how exhausting, is never wasted. That truth, even if ignored for centuries, is never in vain. Because in the end, truth doesn't need the majority to survive. It just needs the ark, a small group of believers holding on through the storm. That's the real covenant of Noah in Islam. Not a rainbow in the sky, but a principle carved into human history. Arrogance will drown, truth will endure, and no storm lasts forever. The ark will always find its mountain. And this leads us to the bigger picture, because Noah isn't the end of the story. He's one link in a chain. After him came other prophets: Hud, Salih, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, all carrying the same core message, all facing the same resistance, all repeating the same warnings. The aftermath of Noah isn't just the start of a new humanity. It's the continuation of a universal pattern. And that's where Islam really connects Noah's story to something larger, a cycle that defines all of human history. By the time you reach the end of Noah's story in Islam, it stops feeling like ancient history and starts feeling like a mirror. Because the point isn't just that a flood happened thousands of years ago. The point is that the psychology of Noah's people, the persistence of Noah himself, and the outcome of that clash, they're all patterns that repeat over and over across human history. In Islam, Noah isn't just remembered as the guy with the ark. He's remembered as a prophet who embodies patience, persistence, and resilience in the face of arrogance. And when you look at the way the Quran tells his story, it's clear. This isn't just about him, it's about us. The Quran draws a straight line from Noah's story to every other prophet. Each one faced the same cycle. They came with a message of humility, gratitude, justice, and faith. Each one was mocked, dismissed, or ignored. And each one, when their people refused to change, saw consequences unfold. Sometimes it was floods, sometimes earthquakes, sometimes invasions, but the principle never changed. Arrogance drowns. Denial destroys. Truth survives. That's why Noah is such a cornerstone figure in Islam. He represents the first major break in human history, the moment where the line between arrogance and faith became crystal clear. His flood wasn't just water washing over land. It was truth washing over denial. It was reality colliding with human pride. And the ark wasn't just a wooden structure. It was the physical embodiment of trust in the unseen, of acting on conviction when everyone else laughs. And here's the part that really sticks. Islam doesn't leave Noah's story in the past. It uses it as a warning for the present. The Quran literally says, "We have left it as a sign. Will anyone then take heed?" That's the point. The flood is a sign, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall based not just on power or wealth, but on humility and arrogance. The lesson is universal. When people mock truth, when they ignore warnings, when they cling to pride instead of honesty, their collapse is only a matter of time. Now, if you really sit with that, it starts to sound less like mythology and more like a law of human nature. Look at history. Empires rise, get arrogant, ignore warnings, and eventually collapse. It's not always water that drowns them. Sometimes it's war, sometimes it's corruption, sometimes it's their own hubris. But the cycle is the same. The story of Noah isn't about one storm in the past. It's about every storm that follows arrogance. And maybe that's why this story still hits so hard today. Because if you think about modern society, you see the same dynamics. We live in a time of massive knowledge, technology, power. We think we're untouchable, that nothing could really shake us. But if Noah's story teaches anything, it's that the moment you start believing you're too advanced to fall, that's the moment you're standing on the shore while the ark is being built behind you. Mockery is easy, arrogance is easy, but humility, that's rare. And in every age, it's humility that survives the flood. For Islam, the lesson of Noah isn't about fearing another global flood. The Quran makes it clear that specific kind of destruction won't happen again. Instead, the lesson is psychological, spiritual, civilizational. It's about recognizing the floods of arrogance, greed, and denial that still threaten to drown us. And it's about realizing that the ark is always there, not a boat, but a choice. The choice to live with humility, to accept truth, to prepare before the storm comes. And here's something powerful. Noah's patience becomes a model for every believer. The Quran doesn't just tell us what he did, it invites us to be like him, to keep speaking truth even when it feels like no one's listening, to keep building, whether that's faith, character, or community, even when people laugh, to trust that the ark, whatever form it takes, will carry us through when the storm finally arrives. At the same time, Noah's people are also a mirror. They show us what denial looks like when it's fully grown. They weren't cartoon villains, they were ordinary people, convinced they knew better, unwilling to humble themselves. That's the danger, because arrogance doesn't feel like evil when you're living in it. It feels like confidence, like security, and that's why it destroys. By the time the waves are crashing, it's already too late to change. And that's why Noah's story matters so much in Islam. It's not about scaring people with tales of floods. It's about showing the consequences of choices. It's about reminding humanity that truth doesn't bend for popularity, that arrogance doesn't protect you, and that patience, no matter how long it seems to drag on, is never wasted. Noah lived for nearly 1,000 years, preaching to people who never listened. To us, that feels unimaginable, but maybe that's the whole point. The story is meant to stretch our perspective, to show us patience on a scale we can barely fathom. Because if Noah could keep warning for 9.5 centuries, what excuse do we have to give up after a few years or a few failures? His endurance is the lesson, his persistence is the arc, and in the end, the universal lesson of Noah is simple, but it's brutal. Truth doesn't need everyone to believe in it to survive. It just needs the ark. It just needs the handful willing to act on it. The rest can laugh, deny, and mock all they want. But when the storm comes, reality doesn't negotiate. That's why Islam puts Noah's story front and center. Not as a myth, not as entertainment, but as a sign. A reminder that we're all standing somewhere between the ark and the flood. And the question is timeless. When the storm rises, and it always does, where will you be standing?